Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Appraisal Buzzcast. As always, make sure you're subscribed to get notified of our latest episodes. Today with us, we have Joan Trice, CEO of Allterra Group, and John Russell, the Strategic Partner Officer at ASA. We're going to be talking about the things going on in the current market, as well as what's going on with policy and Congress. Joan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome, John. I think, John, you were actually one of the very first people that I interviewed on a podcast, and we just started doing these. So welcome back. And
I'm happy to make a repeat appearance. That means that I must not have done half bad the first time.
yeah, exactly. You got invited back. That's always absolutely a good sign. So I don't even remember when that was, but a lot has happened since we last chatted. So let's talk about some of these things. I know the lending community is aware and the AMC community is aware, but I don't think necessarily that the appraisal community is aware of a letter that ended up on Congresswoman Maxine Waters' desk in the last couple weeks. You want to share what that was all about?
Yeah, so I'll certainly speak to it from ASA's perspective for a moment, and then I'm going to maybe share my view on it, which will be a little more pointed, if that's okay. So on February 22nd, a letter went out from Maxine Waters, who is the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, as many of you know, discussing an email that was received by Elizabeth Porter Glenn. Dr. Glenn, she works for the University of New Mexico, does a lot of work on the topic of appraisal bias and discrimination, among other things in her work connected to the university and other studies that she does. And we at ASA, joined by our fellow appraisal organizations, we acted pretty quickly in the strongest possible language to condemn the tone and content of the email. We felt very strongly that the email she was subjected to and its contents were wholly and completely unacceptable. So that's, from an ASA perspective, where we're at. So I'm going to take that hat off. Everything from this point forward is me. It's not ASA, it's the guy who's been doing this 13 years, representing appraisers and the appraisal profession. If I have to explain to you why the content of that email is inappropriate, you should probably rethink the profession you're in, because it wasn't professional. If I have to explain to you why it's not okay to lodge personal attacks against people for having a professional opinion, you should probably rethink what you're doing for a living, because you may not be a professional. If you are going to be an appraiser, you need to be a professional. And that email was unprofessional. And quite frankly, we're seeing a lot of unprofessional behavior lately that reflects poorly on the profession as a whole, and the vast majority of appraisers who are doing the right thing every single day. So if you're one of these people out here who sees this stuff and thinks it's probably okay, I don't know if this is for you anymore. That's me speaking as somebody who represents appraisers in this profession. And I'll tell you, Joan, quite honestly, again, it's me. This is just the guy who's been doing this for a while. It gets harder and harder every day and every week when I have to worry about what's going to come down the pipe that I have to try to explain or defend or justify, because we have reached the point where some of this stuff, quite honestly, is indefensible. And it gets hard for folks like me and others to defend the indefensible. And I would hope that, because again, I still believe in my heart, the vast majority of appraisers are good people and competent professionals. I would hope that when they see this stuff happening, when they hear it from their colleagues, they're going to be the first ones to stand up and tell them that it's out of line and it's not okay. And we need more of that. Quite honestly, we got to do a better job of policing ourselves. I've always felt strongly that appraisers are really good about policing ourselves, certainly when it comes to appraisals that don't meet the expected standard, aren't performed competently. We got to take that same mentality into how appraisers behave on a day-to-day basis as professionals. So that's my 60 seconds. Come to Jesus for you all. And if you don't get it at this point, I don't know what else I can do to help you understand. But that's where I'm coming from.
No, I feel you on that. And I'm going to really mess up this quote, and I don't even remember who said it, but the quote is something to the effect, when good men do nothing, that is the greatest sin. When you see transgressions and you see bad appraisers And I see it all the time in social media. You can't turn in a bad appraiser. That makes you a horrible human being. I respectfully submit it's the other way around. You're part of the problem if you don't want to be proactively a part of making our profession truly professional.
And look, it doesn't mean that every single thing that happens, you have to go trot it up to the state board. If they're making mistakes in the work that they're doing, the mechanics, the nuts and bolts that are fixable, you can have a conversation with a peer and say, hey, I see you doing this, or I noticed you did that.
Right.
And it's not quite correct, and here's why. That's the kind of stuff you can correct them around the margins all day on a peer-to-peer basis in a conversation. But again, some of this stuff that just goes beyond the pale, you got to take action, because if you don't, it's you who's reflected on justice poorly. That people don't disambiguate an individual appraiser from the profession as a whole. So when they keep seeing all of this coverage and all of these stories about things that to the average person come across poorly, it reflects on you individually too. So you have an active role to play in standing up for yourself and your profession, in engaging more frequently, and when you see things that are just not acceptable, having the conviction to say so.
Absolutely. Well, let's do this, John. Let's take a quick commercial break and we'll be right back.
Synchronous education. Delivered in a webinar format, AI Live online education learners sync up with other online participants via a web browser and live conference call. Interact with the instructor and your fellow classmates as you participate in the courses that address today's top appraisal issues and appraisal business practice topics. Enroll in an upcoming offering at appraisalinstitute.org/synchronous-education.
John, so welcome back. And let's talk a little bit about the appraisal subcommittee study they commissioned on bias from the National Fair Housing Alliance via the CLEAR relationship that the subcommittee has with CLEAR. Kind of summarize that for everybody.
Yeah, so the subcommittee had put out a request for proposals along with CLEAR, looking for folks to do a study on the impact of bias and discrimination and the need for greater equity within the appraisal profession. Again, and this is a conversation we've been having for some time. Certainly we had it in the run-up to the introduction of House Resolution 2553 and what that bill looks like. And this is kind of an offshoot from all of those activities. Yeah, and the study they released, I mean, it's certainly thick. I think it's over 80 pages. There's a lot of good history in there in terms of things that if you don't already know, it's worth going back and reading. And we haven't organizationally as ASA, endorsed or opposed any of what's in there, because it's all kind of interconnected. If anything, just a really good jumping off point for conversations around what the profession can do better, because we're not perfect. I think it's important to recognize we need to be striving for improvement every single day in what we do and the work that we do, and ultimately how we serve our communities, right? If we're not constantly working to improve how we go about serving the homeowners and home buyers of this country, for whom this is the single largest investment they will likely ever make, that's not to their benefit. So there are certainly things in there I think are worth contemplating, especially around the topics of getting greater diversity in the appraisal profession. I feel strongly about that. As do we at ASA. That's just something we have to do a better job of, so that we better reflect the communities we serve. And there's just other things in there that you kind of look at and go, oh, okay, I can see where you're coming from. I don't necessarily know that I'm going to get all the way there with you. But it's a good starting point, and it'll be interesting to see when we finally get the PAVE task force report, how much the Venn diagram overlaps between the recommendations in those two papers. But I think it's, again, if we can't engage constructively in the conversation, and it goes back to what I said earlier, and really, if we're going to have different professional opinions, I think there's a way to express that. And I think everybody has a view as to the content of that study and that paper. We just have to be willing to engage productively and find things that we can all, if we're not going to love everything, at least get consensus on the things we know make sense and move forward. And I think there's some things in there that we can probably consider taking forward.
Yeah, I think the good news is it's inspired some really thoughtful conversation on the topic. And one of the questions I keep asking, because I see the terms used interchangeably, and I don't think it should be, but the question of, is the feeling that it is the human element, the appraiser who is biased, or is there bias in our processes, just naturally embedded? What are your thoughts on that?
So it can be a little bit of both, right? And you and I talked about unconscious bias when we talked last time. I think that was really where the conversation was when we last spoke. And unconscious bias and its impact on our daily life, and then how it's especially unique and pernicious at the intersectionality of housing finance and home ownership and all of those different things. So that can certainly be a part of the conversation. I think a lot of good work is being done in that area. Clearly we're seeing a greater focus on fair housing issues. We're seeing a greater focus on unconscious bias. We're seeing bills at the state level to require more education on an ongoing basis on these topics. Those are all good things. I'm really pro-educating on the topic. If we can give good information to appraisers, I feel pretty strongly, if I tell them this is the best way to go about doing things and how to engage with this topic, appraisers by and large will pick it up and run with it. I don't think the profession is as change averse as it's sometimes ascribed to be. I think oftentimes it comes down to getting really good information in front of the appraiser population as a whole. Remembering that about 80% of it is outside the professional organization. So we have to make sure that we find all the different channels and avenues we can to have those conversations. And in terms of process, any process, any system that you build to achieve a specific outcome always has the potential to drive toward outcomes that might be skewed in one direction or another, because it's going to be limited by the experiences of the individual designing the process. So if you don't have an inclusive table designing the process, it may not be thinking about all of the different possible outcomes it's going to have on various communities. If you look at the housing system writ large, the fact that until recently we weren't talking about contemplation of rental payment toward your credit history, when that's a way a lot of folks go about keeping housing over their head, kind of seem counterintuitive when we talk about unbanked and underbanked and their ability to access credit. That's another part of the conversation. It's all kind of interconnected. So it's probably a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. And there are things that we can do to work on both of them simultaneously. And it doesn't require, huge overnight change to really start moving the needle. It just takes recognizing that there are things that can be done incrementally better over time that will have the same big impact, that are not going to be huge life changers in terms of how appraisers go about doing their work on a day-to-day basis.
Excellent. Well, let's take one more commercial break and we'll be right back.
An accurate appraisal is only as good as the data you collect, especially when it comes to measuring GLA. Right from the homeowner's smartphone, RemoteVal uses advanced property scanning and LiDAR to generate exterior and room sketches with GLA dimensions. Testing shows RemoteVal is accurate within 2 inches when compared to standard tape and laser measurements. RemoteVal is fast, easy to use, and completely free for appraisers. To see a demo of RemoteVal in action, visit incenteram.com.
So, John, welcome back. And let's dive into PAVE. We've all been on pins and needles waiting for the results of that study. When are we going to see it? What do you think is going to be in it? And what are you hopeful is going to be in it?
So when we could see it is anyone's guess. It's a parlor game in town. I think there was an expectation we would have seen it sooner. But you have to understand, too, that there's a clearance process. I'm fortunate in that in the downstairs office in my house is a spouse who works for the federal government. So I know very intimately what all of these processes look like from an administrative perspective. So whenever that study was completed, and I believe they were due to be completed with a report into the executive branch around the beginning of February, that then has to go through a clearance process with the Office of Management and Budget. It's standard for anything that's going to come out and have the imprimatur or sign off of the administration in charge. That's not uncommon. So it may just be a matter of the administration wanting to be comfortable with what's in there, maybe seeking changes to certain points. Again, I don't know this for certain, but that's typically what the process looks like. So whenever they complete that process, they'll publish it, they'll make it available. What might be in it? If I'm just spitballing here, I think that the harder things that will be in there have less to do with appraisers and more to do with lenders. I think there was a recognition among some on the task force that appraisers by and large are beholden to the questions that are asked by their clients and their clients' lenders, right? So a lot of the world of appraising begins and ends with that engagement letter and your scope of work and your assignment conditions. And I think the more that that was understood by those kind of going through the exercise at the task force level, they realize it's not just an appraiser problem. And this is something we've said consistently as a profession. It's not just appraisers. We're service providers to a client, and the client wants a product that fits certain, parameters. So you have to be willing to look not just at the appraiser who performs, but at the client, at the hiring party, and what it is they're asking for, because the two work interdependently. Appraisers don't just go and appraise for fun without a client, right? Unless you're doing a demo report for some reason. You're completing an assignment. It's at its most basic. Somebody asks you a question and they want to answer it a certain way. That's what an appraisal assignment is. It's a question and answer exercise. But sometimes your client may not know the right question to ask, the best way to ask it, and the best way for you to go about answering it. So I think that's going to be part of the contemplation, is how to improve that aspect of appraisal work at the initial ordering phase, and what the contours of appraisal ordering and what's expected in the report and the opinions of the appraiser come down to. What I'd like to see in it, my hope would be a focus primarily on, entry into the profession as a whole, with a certain eye toward diversity. But I think we all understand that there are pain points that exist today in entry into the profession, especially around the experience requirement, the need to find a supervisor, the willingness of individuals to take on supervisors, kind of the closed ecosystem environment in which that happens. If you don't already know someone in the profession, it's exponentially harder to get in than it is if you know somebody who's willing to take you on. And it's a combination of things. Certainly there's an economic disincentive. If I can't have a client accept work that my trainees performed independently, it's not a force multiplier for me. So again, it goes back to that client component. If I can get the client to take work that my trainee does, it's a different economic reality for me than if I have a trainee who I'm training solely for the benefit of the profession as a whole. The economic incentive being there is going to be a motivator as well. Not to say also, we've got Korea coming down the pipe relatively soon. And I'm encouraged to see the number of parties who are actively engaged in standing up their programs. I think that we will have a range of options available to those entering the profession. And I've always felt strongly that Korea is going to give people exposure to a broader range of property types, beneficial and adverse conditions, different market conditions that can be simulated, really giving them the type of broad-based exposure that sometimes you just don't get in the current models. If you're working with a supervisor and all they're doing is tract subdivision housing, you're going to be really good at tract subdivision housing. You get one atypical property that's a rural ranch, you're not going to know what to do with that, right? So I think Korea's got some real benefits as well, and hopefully that will be reflected as to where we're going to with the model. So that's what I'd like to see. But again, it's anybody's guess what we see. It's anybody's guess when we see it. I would have thought we would have seen it by now, to be perfectly honest. So hopefully sooner rather than later it's out, and it's another conversation starter for the profession as far as where do we go from here. But I think we're at the point now, there's enough pen to paper on these topics that we can start making some productive and beneficial changes for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. My observation has been in just conversations with folks in Maxine Waters' office and other conversations with folks inside the Beltway is that they're suddenly realizing that our regulatory structure is a mess. Harken back to the spaghetti chart I drew.
The infamous spaghetti monster.
Yeah, 4 or 5 years ago. Everybody now wants to kick somebody for this racial bias but there's who's in charge. And so I'm hoping that they'll take a look at our spaghetti mess, and it would be lovely if we could have a consolidation of regulators into a single valuation regulator.
Well, and I think it's informative. I had a conversation with someone who's more plugged into the consumer advocacy space. And it's really telling when those outside of the appraisal profession see how we're structured, and they have a very kind of strong reaction, and not in a good way, to the current state of affairs. I think it tells you that, you know, what we accept as just this is the way we operate is not aligned with how a lot of other sectors operate, for better or worse. We're structured differently because of the uniqueness of, you know, touching a licensed profession. So you have a state component. You need standards and qualifications from a setter for those, but you need oversight for that qualification standard setter, while you simultaneously need all of the different regulations around different aspects of appraisal practice and how appraisers are communicated with too. And, you know, we just have so many moving pieces. It's almost like we tried to build a plane while we were flying it. And because of that, the pieces don't quite fit right, but it's still in the air. That's the good news. We're still at cruising altitude, but this is the time where we have the opportunity to make necessary changes. You know, what I would hate to see happen, and I think we all need to be sensitive to this. In a worst case scenario, people are going to look critically at the role of the appraiser and the appraisal profession in housing finance transactions and ask why. Why do we still use them? Is there a way to not use them if we don't get our act together? And to maybe put a bow on it, all of this stuff ties back together. It's how we behave on a day-to-day basis. It's how we look at our structures and strictures and make them work better for the people who rely on us and for the public trust. And if we can figure all of that out, there's going to be a long-term role and a long-term seat at the table for appraisers in the profession. But we've got to really be actively engaged in those conversations and be mindful that, you know, this is probably the last best chance to get it right. Because if we don't, I don't want to think what the long-term outcomes may be.
Yes, and by the way, Jim looked up the quote that I butchered, and the quote is, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." So hopefully you got the gist of what I was trying to say. That was much more eloquently phrased than I did it justice for. So, John, thanks for joining us today. Hope to see you in person sometime soon. And
yeah, I was going to say, last time was out at Battle Expo in Las Vegas, and hopefully sooner rather than.
Yeah, that was it was nice to see everybody.
I would be remiss, and my CEO and marketing team would be upset if I didn't mention we have a brand new website at www.appraisers.org. So please go visit that. It's a vast upgrade over what we had. Both in terms of the website as well as how we offer our education through the website. So really go check that out. It's new, it's exciting. I think it's a vast improvement for everybody.
Fantastic. I'm glad you shared that with us. Well, thank you, John.
All right, thanks, y'all.
ProxyPix is the first of its kind on-demand system for getting the location-specific media you need from wherever you are. Their simple-to-use platform creates an online marketplace matching people needing property photos with proxies or data collectors near the requested location. Through crowdsourcing, you can get a current up-to-date photos of anything on the map within hours, if not minutes. Never before has it been quicker, simpler, or more economical to get the property photos you need. Sign up at proxypix.com or download the ProxyPix app, available on the Apple and Google Play Store. Thank you, Joan and John, for joining us today. What an interesting topic. I know this is going to be one of those hot button episodes that we get a lot of feedback on. So we really appreciate your time, John. Thanks for our sponsors who help us put these together, and for all of our listeners. If you have an idea for a future Buzzcast or would like to be interviewed, reach out to us at info@appraisalbuzz.com. Thanks and have a great day.